in the Holy Roman Empire, judicial dueling was an established part of the legal system. So they had courts, they had judges, they had advocates. It was all very official. But if you didn't like the ruling, you could appeal, and the appeal was to a trial by combat, for God to reveal the hidden truth. Now, to the modern mind, this sounds epistemically dubious. What is the connection? There seems to be no necessary connection between success in combat or prowess in combat and the truth or justice of one's case. And it's true that as a one-off, maybe there is no necessary connection. But if you think about it as an iterated process, the people most likely to end up in that situation again and again and again are going to tend to be the worst kind of people. And the more often you end up in that situation, the more likely the odds will catch up with you. And it doesn't matter how good you are, it doesn't matter how strong you are. There's an element of uncertainty, there's an element of chance. And so, it's only a matter of time. If you keep trying your luck, eventually it will run out. And so, as an iterated process, absolutely, you might as well say God reveals the hidden truth, because it tends to weed out disreputable or dishonorable people over time. And one type of people in particular that it especially weeds out are psychopaths and sociopaths, because these are people who tend to be pathologically dishonest, who tend to be manipulative, parasitic, etc. And so they make enemies. They have a glib, superficial charm. They can show up in a place and, pretty quickly start making things work for them. But, eventually they're found out. Eventually, their lies are revealed, and, things start to fall apart, and people are left holding the bill. And, fraud never works out forever. Okay, so it can work out for a little while. Fraud, schemes, parasitism, manipulation, dishonesty can work out for a little while, but it can never work out forever. So eventually it kind of falls apart, and these people kind of have to move on or find a new place. But they create enemies. They leave a trail of enemies behind them, and these are people who might be angry enough to be willing to risk their life to end this person's. And if they have a legally sanctioned method of doing that, judicial dueling, which, by the way, there's also likely to be legal disputes arising out of these kind of shenanigans, and legal disputes that, there's not necessarily going to be agreement on, obviously, if you're dealing with a dishonest person. And, they may even prevail, but you have this recourse to trial by combat. And so this is a situation where psychopaths and sociopaths are likely to find themselves in these duels, these fights to the death. And you might think they would have an advantage because they're fearless and remorseless. But another aspect of this tradition was that the belligerents could have 31 days to train or pray before the fight. And being practical people, the Germans, Holy Roman Empire, typically elected to spend a lot of that time training. Now, who's going to spend more time training? Someone who fears death or someone who doesn't? And furthermore, psychopaths, sociopaths are typically very high time preference people, very present-oriented people. They lack discipline, they have trouble planning for the future, and so they're going to be even further handicapped in that regard. So the system of dueling to the death has a lot of benefits. It weeds out shady people, it weeds out dishonorable people, and especially psychopaths and sociopaths. And I remember reading part of a pamphlet one time that was published, some centuries ago. I don't remember the exact time period or the author, but it was in defense of dueling, and he was pointing out that people always talk about the costs of dueling when they argue against it. The lives cut short. the future productivity unrealized. The family's left fatherless, whatever. There are costs, they're real costs. But they don't look at the costs of the duels not fought. They don't look at the bad manners and the parasitism and the scheming and the lies that aren't dissuaded, or whose perpetrators aren't caught and killed. So those are costs too, and you have to weigh both sides of the issue. There's trade-offs on both sides. And this attitude we have now, which is totally against violence for the most part in our society, is probably not the optimal attitude. We could probably do with a lot more violence than we have now. And, essentially the prohibition on violence within society has really allowed the feminization of our society to progress dramatically, because, at the same time as these legal fetters were being placed on masculine coercion, masculine violence in various ways, whether it's dueling or, the domestic authority of fathers or whatever. At the same time that masculine violence was being fettered, the feminine means of coercion were being unleashed. So, it used to be against the law for a woman to nag and scold in public. There was a legal classification of the common scold, right? And a woman could be found guilty as a common scold and placed in a scold's bridle or a ducking stool. All right, those were legal sanctions on the feminine means of coercion, to kind of keep riotous and uncouth women out of everyone's hair. And those legal sanctions have been removed, those fetters have been removed, those punishments have been removed, and at the same time, the masculine means of coercion, the masculine violence has been restrained and kind of removed from society and delegitimized. And, that's one of the things that's helped the rampant feminization of society. Now, it's had other consequences too. The proliferation of propaganda, pseudoscience, narrative, all these kinds of pilpolistic deception, fraud, financial parasitism, degeneracy, okay? People can do a lot of things now with impunity because they don't have to worry about violent retaliation. They can do a lot of things with impunity that formerly maybe they could not have, because people reckoned those things as a cost and were really willing to retaliate against them. And even if not directly taking matters into their own hands, they had this avenue through sanctioned dueling. They could always challenge someone to a duel, and even if that person didn't accept, they suffered a loss of face or a loss of reputation or a loss of social standing from not accepting that duel. And so, they either had to put up or shut up, essentially. And, so weeded out shady people, curtailed a lot of shady activities, prevented the rampant feminization of society. There's a lot of good benefits to violence that might be worth considering again. And, we're not going to bring this back overnight. I don't think you could set up a sanctioned duel to the death under existing laws, but, we could start bringing this back incrementally. There's no reason why you can't challenge someone to a fist fight or let's say a boxing match, if you really want it to be legit. Or, there are some states where it's a mutual combat state, so you can challenge somebody to a fist fight, and if they accept or consent, then it's golden. But even in states that don't have that, you can still organize a boxing match, and that's perfectly above board. And in many states, there's nothing preventing you from tying a boxing match to, let's say, a court case. The participants in a legal dispute could agree to settle it by resort to a physical contest of some sort. And, there's nothing preventing that. And I know the German filmmaker Uwe Boll, the maker of notoriously bad video game adaptation movies, he's also notoriously touchy about it. So I know on numerous occasions he's challenged film critics who have panned his atrocious movies to boxing matches. And I think at least some of them have accepted. I've seen videos of him beating the crap out of pencil-necked film critics, and that's hilarious. In his case, it can't change the fact that his movies genuinely do suck, as funny as it is. So he can't change that because it's the simple truth and it's ascertainable to everyone. But if you could also shut down, by those means, you could shut down pseudoscience and propaganda and, pilpolistic deception and maybe even feminine coercion. Probably you wouldn't get away with beating up a woman even in a boxing match, but, if you had some male creature engaging in those tactics, you could probably get away with it. And, if people have the ability to engage in shady practices with impunity, without having to worry about retaliation, then, they're going to engage in those much more. But if you could impose even some pain and humiliation on them through like a sanctioned boxing match or something, that would, maybe help to control that somewhat. Not as well as dueling, but somewhat. And it would be a good stepping stone towards re-legitimizing violence, re-legitimizing, the masculinization of society. And, that can be something we do incrementally. We don't have to get it 100% right away. We can take some meaningful steps towards it. That might be one thing we can do. Interesting historical note, which is kind of off topic, but going back to the Holy Roman Empire and the judicial dueling, for disputes between men, the custom was a longsword duel to the death. 2 men would enter the dueling square. No more than one could leave, and sometimes neither of them did. But they also had provisions for duels between men and women, and now, in this case, they didn't consider a longsword duel to be particularly sporting. But what they did was they would dig a pit about waist deep, and the man would stand in the pit with a wooden cudgel, and the woman would circle around him in the dueling square, and she would have one sleeve that was extra long, a few feet longer than her arm, and sewed into the end of the sleeve would be a 2 or 3 pound rock. And so she could circle around and swing the rock at him, and if the man caught the woman and pulled her into the hole, he could, beat or strangle her to death. But if she knocked him out or pulled him out of the hole, then he would be executed. So that was how they did that. And, any legal dispute between a man and a woman could be appealed to a contest like that. And they even had masters who wrote manuals about how to fight in this style and taught the techniques and everything. And really kind of a hilarious historical note. But, I imagine it makes divorce proceedings a lot less messy. Or, more messy in some ways, less messy in others, fewer loose ends, right? So that could be... Anyway, random historical note.